Hanımlar, beyler, hepinize saygı ve sevgilerimizi iletiyoruz. Bugün 22 Ocak 2024 ve Türek ile Yeşil Deniz programının 3. bölümüyle karşınızdayız. 2050 yılında Güneş ile dünyanın en ucuz iki enerji kaynağından biri olması beklenen deniz üstü rüzgar enerjisi için Çin ve Avrupa ülkeleri ciddi yol almış durumda. Bu alandaki teknolojiyi geliştirmek ve tedarik zincirini oluşturmak için Amerika'nın da son yıllarda dahil olduğu yarış hızlanmış durumda. TÜREP olarak Türkiye'nin deniz üstü enerjisi potansiyeli konusundaki farkındalığını arttırmayı, bu alanda özellikle Sanayi ve Teknoloji Bakanlığımız ile Enerji ve Tabii Kaynaklar Bakanlığımız tarafından yürütülen çalışmalara katkıda bulunmayı hedefliyoruz. Aynı zamanda yapacağımız programlarla Türkiye'nin deniz üstü rüzgar enerjisi alanında tabiri caizse bir fotoğrafını çekmek, bu alanda ileride karşılaşabileceğimiz zorlukları ve bunları aşma yollarını yerli ve yabancı konuklarımızla ele almayı amaçlıyoruz. Bunların hepsini bugünkü program konuğum olan Global Rüzgar Enerjisi Konseyi'nin değerli deniz üstü rüzgar başkanı Rebecca Williams ile konuşacağız. Bugünkü programda sadece giriş ve kapanış bölümlerini iki dilde yapacağım. Programın geri kalanı İngilizce dilinde devam edecek. Ladies and gentlemen, today is January 22nd, 2024, and we are here with the third episode of our program, Power of the Wind, Offshore Energy Insights. It is anticipated by International Energy Agency that offshore wind energy will become one of the cheapest sources of energy. China and European countries have made serious progress in offshore wind. The race to develop the technology and to create a resistant supply chain has accelerated. With this program, we plan to raise awareness of Turkey's offshore wind energy potential and contribute to the work carried out by the Ministry of Industry and Technology, as well as Ministry of Energy and Natural Resources. At the same time, we aim to take a picture of Turkey in the field of offshore wind energy and discuss challenges we may. Today, we will discuss all of these with Rebecca Williams. Rebecca is the Global Head of Offshore Wind at the Global Wind Energy Council, a role she has held since December 2021. She brings a wealth of experience in renewable energy, climate change, and energy transition, previously leading the wind industries program at COP 2016-26 and working extensively with Renewable UK. In her current position, Williams is pivotal in driving GWEC initiatives to scale up offshore wind globally, a key component in achieving net zero emissions targets. Hi, Rebecca. Welcome. It's a great pleasure to have you with us today.
Delighted to be here, Ufuk, to talk to your guests here about the offshore wind agenda. Really pleased to be with you.
Could you please introduce yourself and tell us about your journey in the offshore wind energy industry?
Absolutely. So as you set out, my name is Rebecca Williams and I head up all of our offshore wind activities here at the Global Wind Energy Council. So for those of you who aren't familiar with GWEC, with the Global Wind Energy Council, we are a leading industry association who represents the wind industry to the big international institutions such as the UNFCCC, the World Trade Organization, the IMF, the World Bank Group, etc., etc. And in my role, I am specifically working on the offshore wind agenda and helping governments, stakeholders, and the industry in offshore wind markets that are emerging, helping those stakeholders to grow offshore wind within that country. So looking at kind of common themes, but also looking at those markets specifically and helping them grow. The other parts of the puzzle that I concentrate on are also offshore wind's advocacy in these kind of diplomatic circles. So I lead two key initiatives on behalf of GWEC. The first, which is called the Global Offshore Wind Alliance, which is a diplomatic initiative set up by GWEC, IRENA, and the government of Denmark to promote offshore wind. And the second initiative is called Ocean Energy Pathway, which is a new not-for-profit organization set up to be an offshore wind accelerator. So that's a bit about what I do right now. As you said, Ufuk, my background is very much looking at the kind of UK industry. So I was involved with the setup of offshore wind in the UK, working on things like the Offshore Wind Industry Council and really establishing the successful Contracts for Difference framework within the UK as part of my role as head of policy at Renewable UK. And prior to that, I also worked for an environmental NGO for WWF. So I also have the privilege of being able to see this from the kind of wider perspective as well. And prior to that, I've held roles in the UK Parliament, amongst other things. So as I said, absolutely delighted to be here with you today to share my knowledge, which I've gained from talking to governments throughout the world, and also from advancing that offshore wind journey in the UK. So looking forward to getting into the discussion.
Thank you for the introduction. What do you see as the main trends and challenges for the future growth of the offshore wind sector globally?
Great question. And a big question. So I think when we look at the offshore wind situation globally at the moment, it is really one of huge momentum. It's still a relatively young industry. It's one that we've seen grow rapidly over the last period. And now we're standing at about 64 gigawatts of offshore wind deployed globally. But we've got a long way to go. If we're going to meet the targets set out by IRENA, by IEA, we're going to need to be at 380 gigawatts of offshore wind globally by 2030 and 2,000 gigawatts by 2050. So you can see we've still got a long way to go to realize that potential. I think some of the key challenges that we see out there are now around issues such as supply chain, but also just how we scale up. How do we get that regulatory framework right to scale up? And some of the specific challenges around topics like permitting come back again and again in every market that we're working in. So just maybe pausing on some of these. If we're looking at the supply chain agenda, for instance, GWEC brought out a huge new report during COP28, which I urge you all to go and read, which looks at the wind supply chain. It looks both at onshore and offshore wind. And it identifies that if we look out towards 2030, by 2026, in every region of the world, apart from China, we will see supply chain constraints. So from GWEC's perspective, our recommendation is that we need greater collaboration and coordination on the global supply chain situation in order to see offshore wind advance and grow towards those targets of 2,000 gigawatts by 2050 that we were talking about. Then if we look at the more specific challenges, which I'm sure we'll get onto in more detail later, around issues like permitting, grid, etc., I think, again, we really need a shared approach to dealing with some of these challenges. If we look at permitting as an issue, for instance, the global average lead time for permitting at the moment is actually 10 years, which is absolutely crazy. Now we're saying that offshore wind is going to be an integral part of our energy future and on our energy transition. And so really we need to develop policy mechanisms that now accelerate offshore wind. We can't just rely on what's happened in the past.
So I would like to go into details regarding the policies. How do government policies and regulations impact offshore wind projects? Could you share some success stories and failures?
Yes, absolutely. Maybe on the failures, let's maybe call it lessons to learn or room for improvement, perhaps, to keep that positive, optimistic framing. But yes, I mean, as we all know, regulation really affects offshore wind. These are huge infrastructure projects which have significant amount of capex and spend in order to get them in the water, and many different stakeholders in this complex marine environment. So regulatory frameworks, both from the kind of renewables perspective, but also from the marine perspective, are absolutely key to the future success of offshore wind. So if we break that down into a bit more detail, I'd say that we see kind of general principles coming forward when we're talking about offshore wind and what makes good offshore wind regulation. So I already touched on the kind of first key piece of successful kind of regulatory frameworks for offshore wind, which is about the marine environment and how you deal with the marine environment. And typically the countries that have been the quickest to adopt offshore wind and the most successful have usually had some kind of oil and gas background and understand a bit more and more complexity the marine space environment. So what I mean by this is that in many countries, when they're looking at their offshore wind opportunity, perhaps some of them for the first time are considering how exactly they're going to allocate seabed or how they're going to govern and regulate seabed. So it's a huge advantage if a country already has that background. If they don't already have that background, then now's the time to learn from that international best practice and experience and put in place a framework which helps you deal with these different sets of stakeholders that you'll find in the marine environment, which is usually a very congested space. So, exactly how do you get a mechanism in place to ensure that you don't negatively affect biodiversity or encroach onto marine protected areas in a negative way? And also looking at challenges like how do you deal with other industries such as shipping, aggregates, etc. And then also looking at the situation around fishing and how communities which have most recently relied upon fishing for an income, how do you ensure that those communities can have a future within the offshore wind sector, and how do you leverage their skills and expertise and experience? And you need to also consider military uses of the sea, of course. So lots of different complex stakeholders to deal with in this environment. And as I said, having a regulatory framework which from an early stage maps out these different competing uses of the sea in a pragmatic way, and then tries to minimize conflicts between stakeholders is always going to be advantageous to a government or body who is seeking to regulate the offshore wind sector. So that's kind of the first thing I'd say. The second major area to focus on when it comes to policy and regulation from an offshore wind perspective is really this balance between risk and who is best placed to take risk. So as I mentioned, offshore wind projects are, they're very large, they're big infrastructure projects. And the main cost of an offshore wind project is, as we know, the cost of capital. So when we're talking then about the cost of capital that can be achieved, we're really talking about how risk is perceived throughout the project journey and throughout that market. So each part of the project obviously has inherent risk, but then we need to consider things like the offtake for the power. We need to consider the leasing framework. We need to consider what the grid looks like, and how the government itself puts into place the right kind of regulatory framework. So there's all these different layers of risk which are going to affect the cost of capital when developers are looking at a project or looking at a particular country and market. And I think the countries that have had the best approach to regulation learn the lessons, as we're saying, of countries that have come before, and put in place frameworks which adequately deal and share with this risk. So, for instance, if we're looking at offtake models for power or financing of renewables, governments can play a very strong role in reducing that cost of financing by offering government-backed guarantees, for instance. We also see that when we're looking at the kind of development framework, sometimes developers who have a lot of knowledge of how to develop an offshore wind farm are better able to take on some kinds of development risk than governments, for instance, doing it all themselves in a highly centralized way. So there's a real kind of risk analysis that needs to happen here, and a sharing of risks as well as a sharing of wins. So back to your question, Ufuk, who's doing this well, and what lessons can we learn? I think we've obviously seen a lot of best practice come from the European sector, but we also now increasingly see new markets putting in place regulatory frameworks in a fast and efficient way to deal with some of these challenges. So if we look at somewhere like Australia, for instance, which until very recently had very limited appetite although huge technical potential for offshore wind, within the space of a few years, Australia has managed to put in place a really good regulatory framework that, it's not finished yet. It's still a journey. But so far from what we've seen, the correct building blocks are in place in Australia to be able to really leverage the international appetite for offshore wind. So I'd say that that's an emerging market for offshore, which is kind of looking in the right direction. Then if we also consider other markets which are really kind of coming forwards now with some best practices, I think that we can see various different approaches. I think if you look at a market like the Philippines, for instance, there's a lot of desire there to act quickly, to work with industry, to dismantle barriers and bottlenecks, which again, I think is a very appealing way to set out the future direction of your market. Then if we go on to things that kind of haven't worked so well, I think it's fair to say that one of the key issues that we see from the global perspective is, going back to this supply chain challenge, seeking greater and greater local content requirements, protectionism, for instance, really in an international marketplace, that is going to affect the amount of foreign investment you're able to realize. And it also, if implemented incorrectly, can drive up cost of capital. So I think, there's a balance to be struck here between getting that local value and being realistic at the start of the offshore wind journey about what kind of local value you can get into the market, and cost and price. And I think the countries that have really kind of thought about that in an effective way are the ones who are going to be best placed then to realize their kind of offshore wind future. So perhaps a kind of, an example that could be for sure improved upon is the market of Taiwan. So in that market, we see that there has been a strong local content agenda driven perhaps before the industry was able to really build up. And I think as one to watch, I think that is a market where local content rules have had a negative effect on the growth of offshore wind in that sector. So I would highlight that as a challenge, and I hope that looking forward that some of those issues will be resolved and the lessons from that experience will be learned. And we could go into detail for hours and hours, of course, around all the different markets out there and what they've done well and what they could do better in future. But I think just kind of picking up a few of those examples, as I said, it's really about this concept of risk sharing and who's best placed to carry the risk at any particular point, the associated impact of cost of capital, and also about having this strong approach to marine governance and thinking about the interrelationship between supply chain and cost and risk.
You had a good point about Taiwan local content agenda, because Turkey has a success story with applying local content for the onshore wind industry. We have a large industry now supplying the Europe. I hope we can also achieve that in the offshore energy field, balancing it so it doesn't discourage the investors, foreign investors. Now I want to focus on Turkey a bit more. So if you were designing the capacity allocation mechanism for a developing market, what would be the minimum requirements to realize the first projects within 5 years? Feel free to discuss any changes you would make to the permitting process.
I think going back to this concept of risk is really important here. So what can a country or a market do to kind of mitigate and minimize risk? I think one of the key things that can be done, and where we have seen this done very successfully, it has really impacted the growth of offshore wind in that market, is around setting that future trajectory, that forward vision of what the market will do. So setting out a target for offshore wind and then including a roadmap for how you deliver that target is really a way to signal to investors that this place, this country, this market is serious about the offshore wind opportunity. And the reason that's important is then so that investors can make investments on the back of that visibility of pipeline. So I think if we're talking about Turkey and the next steps, I think having that visibility of the roadmap and how to deliver it is very, very important. And that, as I mentioned before, should be done in parallel with a really good, strong industrial strategy for how the market intends to invest in key pieces of the industrial picture to drive socioeconomic benefits. And that industrial strategy should be something which is considered, as I said, in the perspective of risk. So how can you balance the opportunity and the cost of this agenda? So linking that strongly to the roadmap, again, is very important to ensure that you have the supply chain you need for when you want it and when you need it, and also for being able to achieve the best price for citizens who will ultimately be the ones who will use this power and benefit from this power. So that's the first thing, setting out a visible and strong roadmap and target. I think the second thing when we're thinking about capacity allocation or mechanisms to allocate capacity is looking from the perspective of what that country or market is good at already. So I mentioned before, some countries have a history of oil and gas regulation, some do not. Some are quite used to working in a very highly centralized way, whereby the government would take on more risk and coordinate more. So I suppose when I'm talking about this, I'm thinking about some of the European nations, for example, the Netherlands, Denmark, Germany, where the government undertakes more preparatory functions for allocation of seabed. Because in those countries, there is this strong culture of kind of centralization and of municipalities as well. In other countries, we just don't see that kind of cultural understanding. You know, the picture is different. And so in countries that don't have that very strong history of kind of centralization, it probably makes more sense to go for a model which is more akin to the sort of UK or US sort of two-stage approach, whereby the government is not undertaking as many preparatory functions and is instead, laying out different kind of opportunities for developers. Firstly, to get seabed, and then secondly to get offtake, but is kind of pushing more risk onto the developers in a sense, because the developers are used to developing these big projects and are probably best able to bear that risk. Having said that, if you are looking at this two-stage model, it's integral that the country establishes a single point of contact or a named authority who can do this coordination piece between different departments, between different agencies and stakeholders. And for any emerging market, it's absolutely essential that that is the case. Otherwise, you can end up in a situation where perhaps a developer would need to, for instance, gain 10, 20 different permits from different agencies and departments, which would not be a good use of anyone's time, arguably, and wouldn't lead to the acceleration that I think we all want to see. So having that kind of centralized authority might not need to go as far as a one-stop shop. It could be just a named authority that's in control of this coordination piece. But that is absolutely essential to the achievement of capacity within short timeframes. We actually published a report last year with, in coordination with IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency, which looks at recommendations actually for permitting in particular. And it looks across different countries, it pulls out some different case studies, and it gets to a series of recommendations. So I would urge all the listeners to have a look at that report, because it does contain some really detailed points which you can then use in your own market or wherever, whichever kind of market you're looking at. But one of the key recommendations from that report is this centralized authority to deal with this permitting challenge. I think the other point that comes out very strongly is having mandatory maximum lead times for the permitting of projects. In some countries, actually, we heard that civil servants and officials are actually measured, their key performance indicators depend upon solving this kind of permitting challenge in a speedy way. And I don't want to make myself unpopular with civil servants around the world, but it does seem like a good incentive to link this to kind of the performance review process. That's not an official recommendation. I'm just putting that one in there for consideration. But certainly, this has been a hot topic of debate within the European market. So from the European Commission, this mandatory lead times proposal, and I know that it's actively under consideration within other markets as well, to really be able to drive the permitting issue forwards and to prevent what we're seeing a lot at the moment, which is projects stuck for years on end in this permitting doom spiral as we see it. So I think having these mandatory maximum lead times for projects to work their way through the permitting cycle is absolutely key. And then we also have kind of other key recommendations in there when it comes to permitting. So things like aligning ocean use guidance, marine spatial planning, etc., and looking at biodiversity from the start in a pragmatic and proportionate way, rather than having to do this kind of afterwards and replan, which again no one wants to see. So those are just some of the recommendations that we have from the permitting perspective. And as I said, I urge you all to go and read the report. But to come back to your question, Ufuk, I think in terms of what Turkey can do next, it's really focusing on how to drive confidence with investors and to set out this visible pipeline. And also, as we're saying, to look at things like permitting, and that applies to the grid framework as well. So putting in an active strategy for addressing the permitting challenge, both looking at the projects themselves and the marine space, but also looking at grid infrastructure to support those projects. And then, as I mentioned, ensuring that all of this ambition is backed up by a strategic industrial planning process.
I would like to now focus a bit on the infrastructure. Turkey aims to achieve 5 gigawatts offshore wind by 2035, while 2050 targets are still under discussion. Could you please elaborate on the infrastructure investments needed by Turkey to meet these goals and potentially aid the other countries in the Mediterranean basin?
Absolutely. And I think that last point is a really exciting, critical piece of the puzzle here, because I think international focus on the Mediterranean region as a potential powerhouse and a potential hub of clean power is really growing. So it's fantastic to hear that the industry in Turkey sees itself as a key convener in this role of trying to kind of bring together a more strategic regional approach. And I think that's extremely welcome. I think looking at the infrastructure piece, I would return back also to the conversation around supply chain and really ensuring that Turkey has all the pieces that it needs in order to benefit from the supply chain into the future, and also kind of clearly maps out its role in a regional context of what it wants to see produced within Turkey and also exported. So looking at the kind of strategic opportunity from an industrial perspective in Turkey, because that also feeds the kind of next steps and the next considerations too. When we're talking about infrastructure for offshore wind, I think it always comes down to a conversation really about port infrastructure and grid infrastructure. And this is a very common theme across different markets. So I just started to talk about grid infrastructure in my last answer, but really doing the strategic planning of grid infrastructure from the very start, so that you can ramp up offshore wind and ramp up grid infrastructure at the same time, will be integral to maximizing the opportunity, not only of the clean power, but of the whole energy transition. So if we're looking at things like the electrification of different sectors of, electric vehicles, of using things like green hydrogen to reduce emissions from industrial processes, having the right infrastructure in place for those processes to happen will be absolutely key. Then just also looking at the ports question, ports for offshore wind, we all know that then you need to have deep water ports in accessible locations. You need to really think about how you can use ports as a kind of cluster model also for socioeconomic benefits and growth. And coming back to that industrial planning piece that I was talking about, it's essential that as part of that, you consider port upgrades which can maximize not just that particular location, but that whole region. So, for instance, looking at the ports that you have, perhaps there's some ports which you could build more of an industrial cluster around in order to make that happen. So it might be worth concentrating on fewer, better, deeper ports with wider associated infrastructure, looking also at things like tax and spend policy around industrial incentives to really then build and promote the value of that port as a cluster location. And as I just mentioned, when you start to consider things like hydrogen for export, green hydrogen for export, that becomes even more compelling and even more interesting proposal. So I think if Turkey wants to realize its goals, I think that looking again at the ports piece and how to really drive value from the ports piece will be integral to the achievement of those goals.
Thank you. Then my last question, what advice would you have for Turkey to realize the goals for offshore wind?
I think, as I've said, a really important thing for Turkey now is to really rebuild this investor confidence following, the previous offshore wind situation. So looking at what Turkey can do around, setting ambitious but achievable targets, putting out a roadmap, planning from an industrial perspective, and really putting in place the right incentives to achieve that plan. I think these are going to be absolutely key in order to kind of rebuild the confidence of investors in the market. I think, Turkey does have a significant role to play within the Mediterranean region, as we've just identified. And I think that's a really important focus and consideration. But really, the first thing that I think Turkey needs to do is really set out this clear regulatory framework, this structure to really rebuild the confidence of investors. Because, as a market, as a country, it's now in competition with an ever-growing number of emerging markets globally. And I think the more the government can do and the more industry can do to kind of support the government in this endeavour, to set out this clear framework, I think that's going to be the thing that will mean that investment is attracted to Turkey. So I think that's the kind of key action and key first point on the list, is to really rebuild that investor confidence through the ways that I've already discussed.
Thank you very much. Before we proceed to the Q&A session, I would like to summarize my notes, because I had very interesting takes from your answers. And our guests, please feel free to write your questions in the comment section. Konuklarımız, izleyicilerimiz, sorularınızı lütfen comment bölümünden iletiniz. You said it's a relatively young industry. I think this is the best thing about offshore wind energy, especially for a country like Turkey, because we are not too late to catch up with the technology and the supply chain. And it is interesting, supply chain constraints everywhere except China. This is that I'm hearing a lot these days. And we need global collaboration to be successful, to eliminate the constraints. You've mentioned successful countries have oil and gas history. So this is what we were.
They can do. I would say I would say, just to clarify, that the first movers tend to have oil and gas as part of their history. But now we're seeing a whole host of countries coming forward that don't have that history, but have managed to learn the lessons. So it's not a prerequisite. It was just helpful at the beginning, I would say.
Thank you for the clarification. And Taiwan is the bearish example, let's say, in terms of the strong local content agenda, because we know that Turkish government also will try to promote the local content, but we have to look carefully what they did there, and
Yes.
we have some lessons to learn. And you also emphasize the importance of one-stop shop in terms of permitting. A single point of contact is important. You also propose to define the KPIs for the shortening the permittings, and you also said the visible pipeline is important. We have pipeline till 2035. We have a goal, but we don't have a visible pipeline, which we should have as soon as possible, and active strategy for improving the permitting. Thank you very much for all the answers that were very insightful. I'm now checking the comments section. I see Mahir Tosun from Borusan, ENBV. His question is, thanks for the summarized and well-structured information sharing. Appreciate if you could share also actual versus forecasted profitabilities from the investor's view. What are the improvement points? I think you can also read the question on the screen.
Yes, I think it's very difficult for me as an industry association to go into kind of profitability of particular companies, or don't want to infringe upon any competition or antitrust law vectors here. I think this question maybe one of the points that was being raised by Mahir was potentially around this situation we see globally around inflationary environments and how that is infecting different kind of projects. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the broadcast, there's a huge growth trajectory for offshore wind, and we see that coming through very strongly in GWEC's outlooks. And by the way, we'll be publishing another one at the beginning of April. So watch the space for this year's kind of outlook for offshore wind. But one of the trends that we have been seeing is in the US and in the UK, where governments became in a difficult position, as did developers, because locked in prices for contracts that were agreed before COVID, before the war in Ukraine, and before these huge inflationary dynamics that we've seen in the wider global marketplace, these macroeconomic trends came to fruition. So the result of that has been that in the US, some of the contracts were cancelled. And in the UK, there was also a kind of renegotiation, I would say, of the strike price that came through in their offtake mechanism, the contract for difference. So this is something that at GWEC we're monitoring very closely, this kind of inflationary environment. And I think it's touching on many aspects of the supply chain as well. So perhaps supply chain felt these effects first, and then that has been kind of passed through to developers. I think one of the best ways to deal with this situation is for the industry and governments to continue to have a strong and robust dialogue together. Because as we know, this principle of public-private partnership is the thing that has really, so far in the history of offshore wind, been able to kind of achieve where we've got to so far. So it's important that there's an honest and robust conversation around pricing in the sector and around the kind of mechanics that we see in auctions. So from the GWEC perspective, we've seen a lot of focus on pushing down costs to an ever greater degree. But I think, as I've been talking about in this broadcast so far, we need to have a very balanced approach here around what the market or country wants to achieve. If it wants to achieve greater industrial content, then we need to think again about price and whether cheaper and cheaper offshore wind is the right thing in order to bring about these socio-economic and industrial benefits. So there needs to be a kind of a balancing act done here. So I'm not going to answer the question exactly around actual versus forecasted profitabilities, but I think what I've described is in the spirit of that question, how does the kind of cost of capital hinge on these macroeconomic trends, and how is it affected by some of the challenges that we've talked about and the opportunities we've talked about already today.
I would like to remind once again that the floor is open for questions from our audience. I will proceed with the next question. Mayda Özcan from DLC Legal International. She's asking, what are the legal challenges you're expecting from Turkish companies compared to other offshore businesses?
That's an interesting question. I'm not quite sure whether she's getting at Turkish companies compared to international companies, or whether it's just compared to, Turkish companies in offshore wind compared to other offshore businesses. If it's about the latter, I would say that the legal situation surrounding offshore wind, as I've mentioned, is quite complex, because we're dealing with the different regulatory regimes which span land and also marine governance. So I think when we're looking at kind of the public law perspective, we're looking at kind of different regimes governing the use of these assets and the people who work on these assets. And then if we're looking at kind of contracting and principles of contract law, etc., there's various different trends which we're seeing in the marketplace around EPC contractors, etc. But what we are seeing from a kind of legal perspective, which I guess you would say is a challenge, is exactly what I was talking about in relation to this inflationary landscape that we see. So renegotiation of contracts and issues pertaining to kind of project development. So I'd say that those are some of the key kind of legal issues that we're seeing kind of coming up at the moment. If we're talking a bit more about the kind of public law context, then as I mentioned, I think it's around this sort of maritime environment and how we deal with kind of differing regulatory frameworks within that seascape. So hopefully that answers the question there.
Next question is from our president, Ibrahim Erden. He has actually two questions in a row. So first one,
I guess that's allowed since he's the president.
Yes, exactly. He has two to ask. So the Black Sea and Mediterranean might be able to meet Europe's needs for electricity and hydrogen in the future.
Yeah, well, I think this is a really exciting question. And as I speak, I'm aware that no one has really looked into this in a very detailed way yet, which I think is also a very exciting proposition. So I think that's something that we, at GWEC, we have aims to kind of look into further. And I think there's other pieces of work being done by other institutions looking at this very topic. I think what we've seen is, individual countries within this region having a role to play and an analysis being done on that. But I don't think that we've seen the kind of regional analysis yet of the different benefits that could occur from this. So I think step one is to kind of understand exactly what we're talking about and to do some detailed and granular analysis on exactly what that opportunity looks like in terms of gigawatts, but also in terms of that industrial picture that I was talking about. But I think it's obviously a very exciting prospect and picture that now we're seeing more and more emerging markets within the Mediterranean region, within the Black Sea region, all of whom have a kind of strong industrial heritage and are blessed with huge resources. So I think there is a really strong role to play. But as I said, we really need to understand that better from the first principled approach. So if anyone is conducting any research on this topic, I would love to speak to you. And I'm sure Tuwea would too. So let's connect on this topic and put some numbers behind what we're talking about here. And then shall I go on to the second question?
Yes, sure.
Yeah, I mean, again, a really...
This is my favorite so so far.
Yeah,
It's very entertaining to listen about the answers of these questions, China versus Europe.
Yeah, and even in how the question is, how you just framed the question there, China versus Europe, that tells us something, I think, about the geopolitical zeitgeist that we're operating in.
Yes.
But I think from the international perspective and from GWEC's perspective, the whole supply chain of offshore wind around the world is very interconnected. So it's not really a question of kind of Europe versus China. Actually, it's a question of how collectively do we accelerate offshore wind. And if we're going to do that, then as the supply chain is already so globalized and so interrelated, we need to be very careful to maintain lines of cooperation and communication and to have a kind of collected effort to push offshore wind forward. Because in an ever more fragmented situation with, reshoring, with trade disputes, no one wins from that situation. No one wins. So actually, as I mentioned before, when countries are considering kind of supply chains, etc., I think what's really important is to consider their own strengths, but then also to look across the region, to collaborate regionally, to really try to make sure that different countries can have strong export markets for their particular goods and services within this picture that they want to promote. So coming back to the kind of Europe and China question, as I mentioned, we have a report from GWEC, which we brought out at COP28, and which looks at this in a lot of detail. And it's been done in conjunction with Boston Consulting Group, and it maps out 4 different scenarios. The only scenario where we're able to collectively achieve 1.5 degrees, to triple renewables, to have strong home markets for offshore wind is if we maintain a globalized trade effort and we don't tip into this situation and scenario where we have a lot of trade barriers and trade disputes. So I'll leave it there for now, but I would really urge you all to go take a look at this fantastic report, which we've done, as I said, with Boston Consulting Group. So it really kind of mapped out these scenarios in a lot of management consulting detail. And I think that's something that will be of huge interest to you all.
We have 2 more questions. I know we've exceeded our planned time for this interview, but if you have time, we can answer those questions. I will leave it up to you, Rebecca.
Yes, we can answer them. Yeah, that's fine.
So Filiz Karakaya Güler is asking, would GWEC and TÜREB develop a platform for business development between companies? This could be a good opportunity. Yeah, we might take a look into that here.
Yeah, and Filiz, I'm not quite sure where you're joining us from which company, but I'm sure that Ufuk and I would agree that the absolute best way to do business development is to join the industry association, which will allow you to obviously network between peers, be introduced to different peers, and gives you access to those senior relationships. So if you're already a member, fantastic. But if you're not, then that's definitely the first thing that I would recommend. But yeah, interested to explore that conversation further around the specifics, but definitely join your trade association.
The last one from Türker Murat. He is representing one of the tower and gearbox manufacturing facilities in Turkey. Regarding to experiences, any suggestion for local content ratio to success installations? So we need numbers as engineers.
Yeah, great question. But I would urge, having said that we need numbers, I think that sometimes in the local content debate, numbers can actually be unhelpful. And I'll give you an example. So where we have seen percentage requirements for local content, I would say that those percentage requirements have done actually quite little to incentivize proper considered and value creating activities. So for instance, in the UK, we had this, I think it was 64% local content figure for a long time. And actually, I think now what we're seeing in the mature markets is a realization that actually what would be of more value is having this kind of better industrial strategy approach, which doesn't just rely on numbers and percentages, but actually looks at the investments and the value that they create. So I understand that engineers will always like to rely on hard and fast numbers, but instead I would recommend that you put your engineer's brain to solving this complex kind of systemic issue that needs to be approached in a holistic way about how to really incentivize socioeconomic benefit and local content, not just by slapping a percentage or a ratio on a particular project or on a particular region or country or market and saying, okay, this is the target. Actually, a target's no good, as we know, unless you can implement it. And I think this is exactly the same situation. So it's the same reason that while offshore wind targets can be a really good thing in order to attract kind of attention, if the country or the market is not set up to deliver the offshore wind target, what was the point? You need a roadmap and a pipeline to deliver the target. It's the same thing here. So I would urge a kind of bigger picture thinking, which looks at opportunities across different sectors and having this holistic and mapped industrial strategy and supply chain approach, not just a local content ratio or percentage.
We have another question. Beyhan Ülker, she is representing Kalyon Energy. Also, she is the president of our offshore working group at TVEA. What are the most exciting technological innovations we are currently seeing in the offshore energy sector, and how will these innovations change the sector's efficiency and environmental impact?
Yeah, I think this is a great question. Thanks so much, Beyhan. And I think by the last line of the question, maybe you're anticipating my answer, because I think some of the most exciting things that I'm seeing coming through are the ability to use artificial intelligence to avoid and mitigate some of the environmental impacts that we see out there. So I'm already aware of really cool programs which are able to avoid bird collisions, for instance, so that rotors can be turned and blades can be turned to avoid bird collisions, or to better understand and map the movements of marine mammals around turbines. But also looking at things that rely less on artificial intelligence, such as biodiversity kind of gain and measures. So things like artificial reef effects, how biodiversity can be improved and restored by the offshore wind agenda. And I think some of these innovations, and they are still innovations, I think we're still at the kind of cutting edge of science on some of these elements. I think that's where I'm really seeing some exciting things happening. And then just going back to where I kind of started on this question of data. So I think that one of the biggest opportunities that we'll see coming out of this sector, if you understand data and seabed data, you're in a very powerful position as a company or as a country. So looking at the greater uses of these data sets and how these data sets are controlled and used, and how that then kind of flows back into environmental mapping and into yield mapping also for the layout of projects and turbines, etc. I think that area of exploration and investigation is something that I'm really excited about, and looking forward to seeing the next steps this year in some of those elements.
I think that was the last question. Ms. Rupey, do you see any other question from another maybe channel? I guess no. Before we close, Rebecca, thank you very much again, and I want to leave you the floor for the last words, maybe.
Well, thank you once again for asking me to talk to you today. I think it's been a really good discussion, and I'm just really excited about Türkiye's opportunity here. I think some of the ideas that we've talked about today can put the country in a really good position to make the most of this opportunity. But I think it does really come down to the industry being very clear around the points I was making around risk and benefit sharing, and having this close collaboration and cooperation with the government, but also looking at a more regional approach, at a global approach, to be able to learn lessons, but also to solve some of these shared challenges. So I think it's a really exciting time. There's everything to play for. But I think it's about being bold and being kind of strong as an industry about what we can collectively achieve for the next steps. And I know that under the leadership of Tuweya and Tureb that you will be able to get there, I'm sure. So thank you.
That brings us to the end of our interview. Thank you, Rebecca, for sharing your valuable insights today. And thank you to our audience for the engaging questions. We look forward to continuing these important discussions on the future of offshore wind energy. Have a great day. Değerli izleyenler, katılımınız için teşekkür ediyoruz. Programın başlangıç bölümünü kaçıranlar olduysa kaydını sosyal medya hesaplarımızdan paylaşacağımızı da buradan ileteyim. YouTube kaydımızda İngilizce bölümler için Türkçe altyazı da ekliyoruz. TÜREP olarak rüzgarın olduğu her yerde olmaya devam edeceğiz. Bir sonraki programa kadar görüşmek üzere. Sağlıklı günler diliyorum.